Chapter 22. As Miriam struggled with Malbine, her hands pinioned to her sides by his brawny grip, hope died within her. She did not utter a sound, for she knew that there was none to come to her assistance, and, too, the jungle training of her earlier life had taught her the futility of appeals for succor in the savage world of her upbringing. But as she fought to free herself, one hand came in contact with the butt of Malbine's revolver where it rested in the holster at his hip. Slowly he was dragging her toward the blankets, and slowly her fingers encircled the coveted prize and drew it from its resting place. Then, as Malbine stood at the edge of the disordered pile of blankets, Miriam suddenly ceased to draw away from him and as quickly hurled her weight against him, with the result that he was thrown backward, his feet stumbled against the bedding, and he was hurled to his back. Instinctively his hands flew out to save himself, and at the same instant Miriam leveled the revolver at his breast and pulled the trigger. But the hammer fell futilely upon an empty shell, and Malbine was again upon his feet, clutching at her. For a moment she eluded him and ran toward the entrance to the tent, but at the very doorway his heavy hand fell upon her shoulder and dragged her back. Wheeling upon him with the fury of a wounded lioness, Miriam grasped the long revolver by the barrel, swung it high above her head, and crashed it down full in Malbine's face. With an oath of pain and rage, the man staggered backward, releasing his hold upon her, and then sank unconscious to the ground. Without a backward look, Miriam turned and fled into the open. Several of the blacks saw her and tried to intercept her flight, but the menace of the empty weapon kept them at a distance, and so she won beyond the encircling boma and disappeared into the jungle to the south. Straight into the branches of a tree she went, true to the arboreal instincts of the little Mangani she had been, and here she stripped off her riding skirt, her shoes, and her stockings, for she knew that she had before her a journey and a flight which would not brook the burden of these garments. Her riding breeches and jacket would have to serve as protection from cold and thorns, nor would they hamper her overmuch. But a skirt and shoes were impossible among the trees. She had not gone far before she commenced to realize how slight were her chances for survival without means of defense or a weapon to bring down neat. Why had she not thought to strip the cartridge belt from Malbine's waist before she had left his tent? With cartridges for the revolver she might hope to bag small game, and to protect herself from all but the most ferocious of the enemies that would beset her way back to the beloved hearthstone of Bwana and my dear. With the thought came determination to return and obtain the coveted ammunition. She realized that she was taking great chances of recapture, but without means of defense and of obtaining meat, she felt that she could never hope to reach safety, and so she turned her face back toward the camp from which she had but just escaped. She thought Malbine dead, so terrific a blow had she dealt him, and she hoped to find an opportunity after dark to enter the camp and search his tent for the cartridge belt. But scarcely had she found a hiding place in a great tree at the edge of the boma where she could watch without danger of being discovered, when she saw the Swede emerge from his tent, wiping blood from his face, and hurling a volley of oaths and questions at his terrified followers. Shortly after, the entire camp set forth in search of her, and when Miriam was positive that all were gone, she descended from her hiding place and ran quickly across the clearing to Malbine's tent. A hasty survey of the interior revealed no ammunition, but in one corner was a box in which were packed the Swede's personal belongings that he had sent along by his headman to this westerly camp. Miriam seized the receptacle as the possible container of extra ammunition. Quickly she loosed the cords that held the canvas covering about the box, and a moment later had raised the lid and was rummaging through the heterogeneous accumulation of odds and ends within. There were letters and papers and cuttings from old newspapers, and, among other things, the photograph of a little girl upon the back of which was pasted a cutting from a Paris daily. A cutting that she could not read, yellowed and dimmed by age and handling. But something about the photograph of the little girl, which was also reproduced in the newspaper cutting, held her attention. Where had she seen that picture before? And then, quite suddenly, it came to her that this was a picture of herself as she had been years and years before. Where had it been taken? How had it come into the possession of this man? Why had it been reproduced in a newspaper? What was the story that the faded type told of it? Miriam was baffled by the puzzle that her search for ammunition had revealed. She stood gazing at the faded photograph for a time, and then bethought herself of the ammunition for which she had come. Turning again to the box, she rummaged to the bottom, and there in a corner she came upon a little box of cartridges. A single glance assured her that they were intended for the weapon she had thrust inside the band of her riding breeches, and slipping them into her pocket, she turned once more for an examination of the baffling likeness of herself that she held in her hand. As she stood thus in vain endeavor to fathom this inexplicable mystery, the sound of voices broke upon her ears. Instantly she was all alert. They were coming closer. A second later she recognized the lurid profanity of the Swede. Malbine, her persecutor, was returning. Miriam ran quickly to the opening of the tent and looked out. It was too late. She was fairly cornered. The white man and 3 of his black henchmen were coming straight across the clearing toward the tent. What was she to do? She slipped the photograph into her waist. Quickly she slipped a cartridge into each of the chambers of the revolver. Then she backed toward the end of the tent, keeping the entrance covered by her weapon. The man stopped outside, and Miriam could hear Malbine profanely issuing instructions. He was a long time about it, and while he talked in his bellowing, brutish voice, the girl sought some avenue of escape. Stooping, she raised the bottom of the canvas and looked beneath and beyond. There was no one in sight upon that side. Throwing herself upon her stomach, she wormed beneath the tent wall just as Malbine, with a final word to his men, entered the tent. Miriam heard him cross the floor, and then she rose and, stooping low, ran to a native hut directly behind. Once inside this, she turned and glanced back. There was no one in sight. She had not been seen, and now from Malbine's tent she heard a great cursing. The Swede had discovered the rifling of his box. He was shouting to his men, and as she heard them reply, Miriam darted from the hut and ran toward the edge of the boma furthest from Malbine's tent. Overhanging the boma at this point was a tree that had been too large, in the eyes of the rest-loving blacks, to cut down, so they had terminated the boma just short of it. Miriam was thankful for whatever circumstance had resulted in the leaving of that particular tree where it was, since it gave her the much-needed avenue of escape which she might not otherwise have had. From her hiding place, she saw Malbine again enter the jungle, this time leaving a guard of 3 of his boys in the camp. He went toward the south, and after he had disappeared, Miriam skirted the outside of the enclosure and made her way to the river. Here lay the canoes that had been used in bringing the party from the opposite shore. They were unwieldy things for a lone girl to handle, but there was no other way, and she must cross the river. The landing place was in full view of the guard at the camp. To risk the crossing under their eyes would have meant undoubted capture. Her only hope lay in waiting until darkness had fallen, unless some fortuitous circumstance should arise before. For an hour she lay watching the guard, one of whom seemed always in a position where he would immediately discover her should she attempt to launch one of the canoes. Presently Malbine appeared, coming out of the jungle, hot and puffing. He ran immediately to the river where the canoes lay and counted them. It was evident that it had suddenly occurred to him that the girl must cross here if she wished to return to her protectors. The expression of relief on his face when he found that none of the canoes was gone was ample evidence of what was passing in his mind. He turned and spoke hurriedly to the head man who had followed him out of the jungle and with whom were several other blacks. Following Malbine's instructions, they launched all the canoes but one. Malbine called to the guards in the camp, and a moment later the entire party had entered the boats and were paddling upstream. Miriam watched them until a bend in the river directly above the camp hid them from her sight. They were gone. She was alone, and they had left a canoe in which lay a paddle. She could scarce believe the good fortune that had come to her. To delay now would be suicidal to her hopes. Quickly she ran from her hiding place and dropped to the ground. A dozen yards lay between her and the canoe. Upstream, beyond the bend, Malbine ordered his canoes in to shore. He landed with his head man and crossed the little point slowly in search of a spot where he might watch the canoe he had left at the landing place. He was smiling in anticipation of the almost certain success of his stratagem. Sooner or later the girl would come back and attempt to cross the river in one of their canoes. It might be that the idea would not occur to her for some time. They might have to wait a day, or 2 days, but that she would come if she lived or was not captured by the men he had scouting the jungle for her, Malbine was sure. That she would come so soon, however, he had not guessed, and so when he topped the point and came again within sight of the river, he saw that which drew an angry oath from his lips. His quarry already was halfway across the river. Turning, he ran rapidly back to his boats, the head man at his heels. Throwing themselves in, Malbine urged his paddlers to their most powerful efforts. The canoes shot out into the stream and down with the current toward the fleeing quarry. She had almost completed the crossing when they came in sight of her. At the same instant she saw them and redoubled her efforts to reach the opposite shore before they should overtake her. 2 minutes' start of them was all Miriam cared for. Once in the trees, she knew that she could outdistance and elude them. Her hopes were high. They could not overtake her now. She had had too good a start of them. Malbine, urging his men onward with a stream of hideous oaths and blows from his fists, realized that the girl was again slipping from his clutches. The leading canoe, in the bow of which he stood, was yet 100 yards behind the fleeing Miriam when she ran the point of her craft beneath the overhanging trees on the shore of safety. Malbine screamed to her to halt. He seemed to have gone mad with rage at the realization that he could not overtake her, and then he threw his rifle to his shoulder, aimed carefully at the slim figure scrambling into the trees, and fired. Malbine was an excellent shot. His misses at so short a distance were practically non-existent, nor would he have missed this time but for an accident occurring at the very instant that his finger tightened upon the trigger. An accident to which Miriam owed her life. The providential presence of a waterlogged tree trunk, one end of which was embedded in the mud of the river bottom, and the other end of which floated just beneath the surface where the prow of Malbine's canoe ran upon it as he fired. The slight deviation of the boat's direction was sufficient to throw the muzzle of the rifle out of aim. The bullet whizzed harmlessly by Miriam's head, and an instant later she had disappeared into the foliage of the tree. There was a smile on her lips as she dropped to the ground to cross a little clearing where once had stood a native village surrounded by its fields. The ruined huts still stood in crumbling decay. The rank vegetation of the jungle overgrew the cultivated ground. Small trees already had sprung up in what had been the village street, but desolation and loneliness hung like a pall above the scene. To Miriam, however, it presented but a place denuded of large trees which she must cross quickly to regain the jungle upon the opposite side before Malbine should have landed. The deserted huts were, to her, all the better because they were deserted. She did not see the keen eyes watching her from a dozen points, from tumbling doorways, from behind tottering granaries. In utter unconsciousness of impending danger, she started up the village street because it offered the clearest pathway to the jungle. A mile away toward the east, fighting his way through the jungle along the trail taken by Malbine when he had brought Miriam to his camp, a man in torn khaki, filthy, haggard, unkempt, came to a sudden stop as the report of Malbine's rifle resounded faintly through the tangled forest. The black man just ahead of him stopped too. "We are almost there, Bwana," he said. There was awe and respect in his tone and manner. The white man nodded and motioned his ebon guide forward once more. It was the Honorable Morrison Baines, the fastidious, the exquisite. His face and hands were scratched and smeared with dried blood from the wounds he had come by in thorn and thicket. His clothes were tatters. But through the blood and the dirt and the rags a new Baines shone forth, a handsomer Baines than the dandy and the fop of yore. In the heart and soul of every son of woman lies the germ of manhood and honor, remorse for a scurvy act, and an honorable desire to right the wrong he had done. The woman he now knew he really loved had excited these germs to rapid growth in Morrison Baines, and the metamorphosis had taken place. Onward the two stumbled toward the point from which the single rifle shot had come. The black was unarmed. Baines, fearing his loyalty, had not dared trust him even to carry the rifle which the white man would have been glad to be relieved of many times upon the long march. But now that they were approaching their goal, and knowing as he did that hatred of Malbine burned hot in the black man's brain, Baines handed him the rifle, for he guessed that there would be fighting. He intended that there should, for he had come to avenge. Himself, an excellent revolver shot, would depend upon the smaller weapon at his side. As the two forged ahead toward their goal, they were startled by a volley of shots ahead of them. Then came a few scattering reports, some savage yells, and silence. Baines was frantic in his endeavors to advance more rapidly, but there the jungle seemed 1,000 times more tangled than before. 12 times he tripped and fell. Twice the black followed a blind trail, and they were forced to retrace their steps. But at last they came out into a little clearing near the Big Affy, a clearing that once held a thriving village, but lay somber and desolate in decay and ruin. In the jungle vegetation that overgrew what had once been the main village street lay the body of a black man, pierced through the heart with a bullet and still warm. Baines and his companion looked about in all directions, but no sign of living being could they discover. They stood in silence, listening intently. What was that? Voices and the dip of paddles out upon the river? Baines ran across the dead village toward the fringe of jungle upon the river's brim. The black was at his side. Together they forced their way through the screening foliage until they could obtain a view of the river, and there, almost to the other shore, they saw Malbine's canoes making rapidly for camp. The black recognized his companions immediately. "How can we cross?" asked Baines. The black shook his head. There was no canoe, and the crocodiles made it equivalent to suicide to enter the water in an attempt to swim across. Just then the fellow chanced to glance downward. Beneath him, wedged among the branches of a tree, lay the canoe in which Miriam had escaped. The Negro grasped Baines's arm and pointed toward his find. The Honorable Morrison could scarce repress a shout of exultation. Quickly the two slid down the drooping branches into the boat. The black seized the paddle, and Baines shoved them out from beneath the tree. A second later, the canoe shot out upon the bosom of the river and headed toward the opposite shore and the camp of the Swede. Baines squatted in the bow, straining his eyes after the men pulling the other canoes upon the bank across from him. He saw Malbine step from the bow of the foremost of the little craft. He saw him turn and glance back across the river. He could see his start of surprise as his eyes fell upon the pursuing canoe and called the attention of his followers to it. Then he stood waiting, for there was but one canoe and 2 men. Little danger to him and his followers in that. Malbine was puzzled. Who was this white man? He did not recognize him, though Baines's canoe was now in midstream and the features of both its occupants plainly discernible to those on shore. One of Malbine's blacks. It was who first recognized his fellow black in the person of Baines's companion. Then Malbine guessed who the white man must be, though he could scarce believe his own reasoning. It seemed beyond the pale of wildest conjecture to suppose that the Honorable Morrison Baines had followed him through the jungle with but a single companion. And yet it was true. Beneath the dirt and dishevelment he recognized him at last, and in the necessity of admitting that it was he, Malbine was forced to recognize the incentive that had driven Baines, the weakling and coward, through the savage jungle upon his trail. The man had come to demand an accounting and to avenge. It seemed incredible, and yet there could be no other explanation. Malbine shrugged. Well, others had sought Malbine for similar reasons in the course of a long and checkered career. He fingered his rifle and waited. Now the canoe was within easy speaking distance of the shore. "What do you want?" yelled Malbine, raising his weapon threateningly. The Honorable Morrison Baines leaped to his feet. "You, damn you!" he shouted, whipping out his revolver and firing almost simultaneously with the Swede. As the two reports rang out, Malbine dropped his rifle, clutched frantically at his breast, staggered, fell first to his knees, and then lunged upon his face. Baines stiffened. His head flew back spasmodically. For an instant he stood thus, and then crumpled very gently into the bottom of the boat. The black paddler was at a loss as to what to do. If Malbine really were dead, he could continue on to join his fellows without fear, but should the Swede only be wounded, he would be safer upon the far shore. Therefore he hesitated, holding the canoe in midstream. He had come to have considerable respect for his new master and was not unmoved by his death. As he sat gazing at the crumpled body in the bow of the boat, he saw it move. Very feebly, the man essayed to turn over. He still lived. The black moved forward and lifted him to a sitting position. He was standing in front of him, his paddle in one hand, asking Baines where he was hit when there was another shot from shore, and the Negro pitched headlong overboard, his paddle still clutched in his dead fingers. Shot through the forehead. Baines turned weakly in the direction of the shore to see Malbine drawn up upon his elbows, leveling his rifle at him. The Englishman slid to the bottom of the canoe as a bullet whizzed above him. Malbine, sore hit, took longer in aiming, nor was his aim as sure as formerly. With difficulty, Baines turned himself over on his belly and, grasping his revolver in his right hand, drew himself up until he could look over the edge of the canoe. Malbine saw him instantly and fired, but Baines did not flinch or duck. With painstaking care, he aimed at the target upon the shore from which he now was drifting with the current. His finger closed upon the trigger. There was a flash and a report, and Malbine's giant frame jerked to the impact of another bullet. But he was not yet dead. Again he aimed and fired, the bullet splintering the gunwale of the canoe close by Baines's face. Baines fired again as his canoe drifted further downstream, and Malbine answered from the shore where he lay in a pool of his own blood. And thus, doggedly, the two wounded men continued to carry on their weird duel until the winding African river had carried the Honorable Morrison Baines out of sight around a wooded point. Chapter 23. Miriam had traversed half the length of the village street when a score of white-robed Negroes and half-castes leaped out upon her from the dark interiors of surrounding huts. She turned to flee, but heavy hands seized her, and when she turned at last to plead with them, her eyes fell upon the face of a tall, grim, old man glaring down upon her from beneath the folds of his burnous. At sight of him, she staggered back in shocked and terrified surprise. It was the Sheik. Instantly, all the old fears and terrors of her childhood returned upon her. She stood trembling before this horrible old man as a murderer before the judge about to pass sentence of death upon him. She knew that the Sheik recognized her. The years and the changed raiment had not altered her so much, but what one who had known her features so well in childhood would know her now. "So you have come back to your people, eh?" snarled the Sheik. "Come back begging for food and protection, eh?" "Let me go," cried the girl. "I ask nothing of you but that you let me go back to the Big Bwana." "The Big Bwana?" almost screamed the Sheik, and then followed a stream of profane Arabic invective against the white man whom all the transgressors of the jungle feared and hated. "You would go back to the Big Bwana, would you? So that is where you have been since you ran away from me, is it? And who comes now across the river after you? The Big Bwana? The Swede whom you once chased away from your country when he and his companion conspired with Enbita to steal me from you," replied Miriam. The sheik's eyes blazed, and he called his men to approach the shore and hide among the bushes that they might ambush and annihilate Malbeen and his party. But Malbeen already had landed, and crawling through the fringe of jungle was at that very moment looking with wide and incredulous eyes upon the scene being enacted in the street of the deserted village. He recognized the sheik the moment his eyes fell upon him. There were two men in the world that Malbeen feared as he feared the devil. One was the big Bwana, and the other the sheik. A single glance he took at that gaunt, familiar figure, and then he turned tail and scurried back to his canoe, calling his followers after him. And so it happened that the party was well out in the stream before the sheik reached the shore, and after a volley and a few parting shots that were returned from the canoes, the Arab called his men off and, securing his prisoner, set off toward the south. One of the bullets from Malbeen's force had struck a black standing in the village street where he had been left with another to guard Miriam, and his companions had left him where he had fallen after appropriating his apparel and belongings. His was the body that Baines had discovered when he had entered the village. The sheik and his party had been marching southward along the river when one of them, dropping out of line to fetch water, had seen Miriam paddling desperately from the opposite shore. The fellow had called the sheik's attention to the strange sight. A white woman alone in Central Africa, and the old Arab had hidden his men in the deserted village to capture her when she landed, for thoughts of ransom were always in the mind of the sheik. More than once before had glittering gold filtered through his fingers from a similar source. It was easy money, and the sheikh had none too much easy money, since the big Bwana had so circumscribed the limits of his ancient domain that he dared not even steal ivory from natives within 200 miles of the big Bwana's douar. And when at last the woman had walked into the trap he had set for her, and he had recognized her as the same little girl he had brutalized and maltreated years before, his gratification had been huge. Now he lost no time in establishing the old relations of father and daughter that had existed between them in the past. At the first opportunity, he struck her a heavy blow across the face. He forced her to walk when he might have dismounted one of his men instead, or had her carried on a horse's rump. He seemed to revel in the discovery of new methods for torturing or humiliating her, and among all his followers she found no single one to offer her sympathy, or who dared defend her, even had they had the desire to do so. A 2 days' march brought them at last to the familiar scenes of her childhood, and the first face upon which she set her eyes as she was driven through the gates into the strong stockade was that of the toothless, hideous Mabunu, her one-time nurse. It was as though all the years that had intervened were but a dream. Had it not been for her clothing and the fact that she had grown in stature, she might well have believed it so. All was there as she had left it. The new faces which supplanted some of the old were of the same bestial, degraded type. There were a few young Arabs who had joined the sheik since she had been away, otherwise all was the same, all but one. Geeka was not there, and she found herself missing Geeka, as though the ivory-headed one had been a flesh-and-blood intimate and friend. She missed her ragged little confidant, into whose deaf ears she had been wont to pour her many miseries and her occasional joys. Geeka, of the splinter limbs and the rat-skin torso. Geeka, the disreputable. Geeka, the beloved. For a time, the inhabitants of the sheik's village, who had not been upon the march with him, amused themselves by inspecting the strangely clad white girl, whom some of them had known as a little child. Mabunu pretended great joy at her return, baring her toothless gums in a hideous grimace that was intended to be indicative of rejoicing. But Miriam could but shudder as she recalled the cruelties of this terrible old hag in the years gone by. Among the Arabs who had come in her absence was a tall young fellow of 20, a handsome, sinister-looking youth, who stared at her in open admiration until the sheik came and ordered him away, and Abdul Kamak went scowling. At last, their curiosity satisfied, Miriam was alone. As of old, she was permitted the freedom of the village, for the stockade was high and strong, and the only gates were well guarded by day and by night. But as of old, she cared not for the companionship of the cruel Arabs and the degraded blacks who formed the following of the sheik, and so, as had been her wont in the sad days of her childhood, she slunk down to an unfrequented corner of the enclosure where she had often played at housekeeping with her beloved Geeka beneath the spreading branches of the great tree that had overhung the palisade. But now the tree was gone, and Miriam guessed the reason. It was from this tree that Korak had descended and struck down, the sheik, the day that he had rescued her from the life of misery and torture that had been her lot for so long that she could remember no other. There were low bushes growing within the stockade, however, and in the shade of these Miriam sat down to think. A little glow of happiness warmed her heart as she recalled her first meeting with Korak, and then the long years that he had cared for and protected her with the solicitude and purity of an elder brother. For months Korak had not so occupied her thoughts as he did today. He seemed closer and dearer now than ever he had before, and she wondered that her heart had drifted so far from loyalty to his memory. And then came the image of the Honorable Morrison, the exquisite, and Miriam was troubled. Did she really love the flawless young Englishman? She thought of the glories of London, of which he had told her in such glowing language. She tried to picture herself admired and honored in the midst of the gayest society of the great capital. The pictures she drew were the pictures that the Honorable Morrison had drawn for her. They were alluring pictures, but through them all, the brawny, half-naked figure of the giant Adonis of the jungle persisted in obtruding itself. Miriam pressed her hand above her heart as she stifled a sigh, and as she did so, she felt the hard outlines of the photograph she had hidden there as she slunk from Malbine's tent. Now she drew it forth and commenced to re-examine it more carefully than she had had time to do before. She was sure that the baby face was hers. She studied every detail of the picture. Half hidden in the lace of the dainty dress rested a chain and locket. Miriam puckered her brows. What tantalizing half-memories it awakened! Could this flower of evident civilization be the little Arab Miriam, daughter of the sheik? It was impossible, and yet that locket, Miriam knew it. She could not refute the conviction of her memory. She had seen that locket before, and it had been hers. What strange mystery lay buried in her past? As she sat gazing at the picture, she suddenly became aware that she was not alone, that someone was standing close behind her, someone who had approached her noiselessly. Guiltily, she thrust the picture back into her waist. A hand fell upon her shoulder. She was sure that it was the sheik, and she awaited in dumb terror the blow that she knew would follow. No blow came, and she looked upward over her shoulder, into the eyes of Abdul Kamak, the young Arab. "I saw," he said, "the picture that you have just hidden. It is you when you were a child, a very young child. May I see it again?" Miriam drew away from him. "I will give it back," he said. "I have heard of you, and I know that you have no love for the sheik, your father. Neither have I. I will not betray you. Let me see the picture." Friendless among cruel enemies, Miriam clutched at the straw that Abdul Kamak held out to her. Perhaps in him she might find the friend she needed. Anyway, he had seen the picture, and if he was not a friend, he could tell the sheik about it, and it would be taken away from her, so she might as well grant his request and hope that he had spoken fairly and would deal fairly. She drew the photograph from its hiding place and handed it to him. Abdul Kamak examined it carefully, comparing it feature by feature with the girl sitting on the ground, looking up into his face. Slowly he nodded his head. "Yes," he said, "it is you, but where was it taken? How does it happen that the sheik's daughter is clothed in the garments of the unbeliever?" "I do not know," replied Miriam. "I never saw the picture until a couple of days ago, when I found it in the tent of the Swede, Malbine." Abdul Kamak raised his eyebrows. He turned the picture over, and as his eyes fell upon the old newspaper cutting, they went wide. He could read French with difficulty, it is true, but he could read it. He had been to Paris. He had spent 6 months there with a troupe of his desert fellows upon exhibition, and he had improved his time, learning many of the customs, some of the language, and most of the vices of his conquerors. Now he put his learning to use. Slowly, laboriously, he read the yellowed cutting. His eyes were no longer wide. Instead, they narrowed to 2 slits of cunning. When he had done, he looked at the girl. "You have read this?" he asked. "It is French," she replied, "and I do not read French." Abdul-Kamak stood long in silence looking at the girl. She was very beautiful. He desired her, as had many other men who had seen her. At last he dropped to one knee beside her. A wonderful idea had sprung to Abdul-Kamak's mind. It was an idea that might be furthered if the girl were kept in ignorance of the contents of that newspaper cutting. It would certainly be doomed should she learn its contents. "Miriam," he whispered, "never until today have my eyes beheld you, yet at once they told my heart that it must ever be your servant. You do not know me, but I ask that you trust me. I can help you. You hate the sheik. So do I. Let me take you away from him. Come with me, and we will go back to the great desert, where my father is a sheik mightier than is yours. Will you come?" Miriam sat in silence. She hated to wound the only one who had offered her protection and friendship, but she did not want Abdul-Kamak's love. Deceived by her silence, the man seized her and strained her to him. But Miriam struggled to free herself. "I do not love you," she cried. "Oh, please do not make me hate you. You are the only one who has shown kindness toward me, and I want to like you, but I cannot love you." Abdul-Kamak drew himself to his full height. "You will learn to love me," he said, "for I shall take you whether you will or no. You hate the sheik, and so you will not tell him, for if you do, I will tell him of the picture. I hate the sheik and—" "You hate the sheik?" came a grim voice from behind them. Both turned to see the sheik standing a few paces from them. Abdul still held the picture in his hand. Now he thrust it within his burnous. "Yes," he said, "I hate the sheik." And as he spoke, he sprang toward the older man, felled him with a blow, and dashed on across the village to the line where his horse was picketed, saddled, and ready. For Abdul-Kamak had been about to ride forth to hunt when he had seen the stranger girl alone by the bushes. Leaping into the saddle, Abdul-Kamak dashed for the village gates. The sheik, momentarily stunned by the blow that had felled him, now staggered to his feet, shouting lustily to his followers to stop the escaped Arab. A dozen blacks leaped forward to intercept the horseman, only to be ridden down or brushed aside by the muzzle of Abdul-Kamak's long musket, which he lashed from side to side about him as he spurred on toward the gate. But here he must surely be intercepted. Already the 2 blacks stationed there were pushing the unwieldy portals too. Up flew the barrel of the fugitive's weapon. With reins flying loose and his horse at a mad gallop, the son of the desert fired once, twice, and both the keepers of the gate dropped in their tracks. With a wild whoop of exultation, twirling his musket high above his head and turning in his saddle to laugh back into the faces of his pursuers, Abdul-Kamak dashed out of the village of the sheik and was swallowed up by the jungle. Foaming with rage, the sheik ordered immediate pursuit and then strode rapidly back to where Miriam sat huddled by the bushes where he had left her. "The picture," he cried. "What picture did the dog speak of? Where is it? Give it to me at once." "He took it," replied Miriam dully. "What was it?" again demanded the sheik, seizing the girl roughly by the hair and dragging her to her feet, where he shook her venomously. "What was it a picture of?" "Of me," said Miriam, "when I was a little girl. I stole it from Malbeen, the Swede. It had printing on the back cut from an old newspaper." The sheik went white with rage. "What said the printing?" he asked, in a voice so low that she but barely caught his words. "I do not know." It was in French, and I cannot read French." The sheik seemed relieved. He almost smiled, nor did he again strike Miriam before he turned and strode away with the parting admonition that she speak never again to any other than Mabunu and himself. And along the caravan trail galloped Abdul Kamak toward the north. As his canoe drifted out of sight and range of the wounded Swede, the Honorable Morrison sank weakly to its bottom, where he lay for long hours in partial stupor. It was night before he fully regained consciousness. And then he lay for a long time looking up at the stars and trying to recollect where he was, what accounted for the gently rocking motion of the thing upon which he lay, and why the position of the stars changed so rapidly and miraculously. For a while he thought he was dreaming, but when he would have moved to shake sleep from him, the pain of his wound recalled to him the events that had led up to his present position. Then it was that he realized that he was floating down a great African river in a native canoe, alone, wounded, and lost. Painfully he dragged himself to a sitting position. He noticed that the wound pained him less than he had imagined it would. He felt of it gingerly. It had ceased to bleed. Possibly it was but a flesh wound after all, and nothing serious. If it totally incapacitated him, even for a few days, it would mean death, for by that time he would be too weakened by hunger and pain to provide food for himself. From his own troubles, his mind turned to Miriam's. That she had been with the Swede at the time he had attempted to reach the fellow's camp he naturally believed, but he wondered what would become of her now. Even if Hansen died of his wounds, would Miriam be any better off? She was in the power of equally villainous men, brutal savages of the lowest order. Baines buried his face in his hands and rocked back and forth as the hideous picture of her fate burned itself into his consciousness. And it was he who had brought this fate upon her. His wicked desire had snatched a pure and innocent girl from the protection of those who loved her to hurl her into the clutches of the bestial Swede and his outcast following, and not until it had become too late had he realized the magnitude of the crime he himself had planned and contemplated. Not until it had become too late had he realized that greater than his desire, greater than his lust, greater than any passion he had ever felt before, was the newborn love that burned within his breast for the girl he would have ruined. The Honorable Morrison Baines did not fully realize the change that had taken place within him. Had one suggested that he ever had been aught than the soul of honor and chivalry, he would have taken umbrage forthwith. He knew that he had done a vile thing when he had plotted to carry Miriam away to London, yet he excused it on the ground of his great passion for the girl having temporarily warped his moral standards by the intensity of its heat. But, as a matter of fact, a new Baines had been born. Never again could this man be bent to dishonor by the intensity of a desire. His moral fiber had been strengthened by the mental suffering he had endured. His mind and his soul had been purged by sorrow and remorse. His one thought now was to atone, win to Miriam's side, and lay down his life, if necessary, in her protection. His eyes sought the length of the canoe in search of the paddle, for a determination had galvanized him to immediate action despite his weakness and his wound. But the paddle was gone. He turned his eyes toward the shore. Dimly through the darkness of a moonless night he saw the awful blackness of the jungle, yet it touched no responsive chord of terror within him now as it had done in the past. He did not even wonder that he was unafraid, for his mind was entirely occupied with thoughts of another's danger. Drawing himself to his knees, he leaned over the edge of the canoe and commenced to paddle vigorously with his open palm. Though it tired and hurt him, he kept assiduously at his self-imposed labor for hours. Little by little, the drifting canoe moved nearer and nearer the shore. The Honorable Morrison could hear a lion roaring directly opposite him, and so close that he felt he must be almost to the shore. He drew his rifle closer to his side, but he did not cease to paddle. After what seemed to the tired man an eternity of time, he felt the brush of branches against the canoe and heard the swirl of the water about them. A moment later, he reached out and clutched a leafy limb. Again, the lion roared. Very near it seemed now, and Baines wondered if the brute could have been following along the shore, waiting for him to land. He tested the strength of the limb to which he clung. It seemed strong enough to support 12 men. Then he reached down and lifted his rifle from the bottom of the canoe, slipping the sling over his shoulder. Again he tested the branch, and then, reaching upward as far as he could for a safe hold, he drew himself painfully and slowly upward until his feet swung clear of the canoe, which, released, floated silently from beneath him to be lost forever in the blackness of the dark shadows downstream. He had burned his bridges behind him. He must either climb aloft or drop back into the river, but there had been no other way. He struggled to raise one leg over the limb, but found himself scarce equal to the effort, for he was very weak. For a time he hung there, feeling his strength ebbing. He knew that he must gain the branch above at once, or it would be too late. Suddenly the lion roared almost in his ear. Baines glanced up. He saw 2 spots of flame a short distance from and above him. The lion was standing on the bank of the river, glaring at him and waiting for him. Well, thought the Honorable Morrison, let him wait. Lions can't climb trees, and if I get into this one, I shall be safe enough from him. The young Englishman's feet hung almost to the surface of the water, closer than he knew, for all was pitch dark below as above him. Presently he heard a slight commotion in the river beneath him, and something banged against one of his feet, followed almost instantly by a sound that he felt he could not have mistaken, the click of great jaws snapping together. "By George!" exclaimed the Honorable Morrison aloud. "The beggar nearly got me," and immediately he struggled again to climb higher and to comparative safety, but with that final effort he knew that it was futile. Hope that had survived persistently until now began to wane. He felt his tired, numbed fingers slipping from their hold. He was dropping back into the river, into the jaws of the frightful death that awaited him there. And then he heard the leaves above him rustle to the movement of a creature among them. The branch to which he clung bent beneath an added weight, and no light weight from the way it sagged, but still Baines clung desperately. He would not give up voluntarily either to the death above or the death below. He felt a soft, warm pad upon the fingers of one of his hands, where they circled the branch to which he clung, and then something reached down out of the blackness above and dragged him up among the branches of the tree.